is Gabriela Giron, and today we're going to be talking about repressions of female sexuality and cannibalism. So, throughout time, the role of the woman has been to be a wife, a caretaker. Just because she is born a woman, she's supposed to nurture her children and feed her husband. This idea of women can be a bit bad for women specifically because, of course, they are reduced to just those two aspects of having to be a wife and a mother. And so in order to conform to these standards, they repress their own identities, they repress their own desires. And this has been seen throughout time in various media, which is what led me to develop my research question of how does the portrayal of modern female sexuality in the films Amis and Bones and All reflect the motif of the Eden heart in medieval Indo-European literature. So scholars have debated for a long time the origins of the legend of the Eden heart. However, they know that it follows the storyline of a cheating wife. She is caught by her husband, and when her husband finds out, he goes through a jealous rage and he decides to kill his wife's lover, take out his heart, cook it, and have it fed to his wife unknowingly. Whenever his wife finds out about what she just ate, she usually kills herself at the end of the story, typically by either throwing herself from a high place as depicted here, or by starving herself to death, and in some cases it's a combination of both. One of the most common stories with the motif is the French Les d'Ignore, which essentially, instead of there being only one cheating wife, there is 12 cheating wives. They all cheat on their husbands with the same man, and all 12 husbands find out, they decide to kill all their wives' lover. They take a small piece each for their wives and feed it to their wives. And whenever the wives learn about this, they decide to starve themselves to death. And there's also a similar story found in Indian literature, which is the story of Raja Rasalu, which essentially Rasalu raises his wife from a very young age, and whenever she's old enough, they get married. So throughout her life, all that his wife has known is just Rasalu, because she's been hidden away. So one day a neighboring prince comes to town, they fall in love, and she cheats on her husband. So Rasalu finds out, he decides to ambush her lover and has his heart cut out, and he gives it to the wife to cook it herself. She doesn't know that it's his heart, but she cooks it anyway, she eats it, she's like, wow, this is really good, what is it? And the husband was like, here's your lover's head. And so she decides to throw herself from a high wall. And so in both of the stories, and in many other stories found in literature, the women eventually kill themselves. So, although depicted very differently, this motif of the Eden heart can be seen in modern cinema. And so for this project, I chose the Indian film in the Assamese language, Amis, released in 2019, and Bones and All, which is an American film released in 2022. So, Amis follows the story of Nirmali, who is a pediatrician wife and mother, and Suman, who is a PhD student fascinated by exotic meats. So the two of them meet and they form a bond because of their shared love of exotic foods, exotic meats. And initially it's a platonic friendship, but eventually it develops into a little bit more. But Nirmali, knowing that she's married, she has a son, she refrains from having any sort of physical touch, any sort of romantic affiliation with him. However, Suman develops a very strong obsession with Nirmali, and one day he has a dream where he dreams that he is physically, his entire body is inside of Nirmali, and when he wakes up from that dream, he decides that he is going to cut a piece of his flesh from his thigh and feed it to Nirmali without her knowing. Initially, when Nirmali finds out what she just ate, she's initially disgusted, she throws up, but very soon after, literally like 5 minutes later, she starts developing an obsession with eating human flesh. Eventually, the small pieces that Suman feeds her every once in a while become insufficient for her to satisfy her needs, so Suman kills a man to try to feed it to her, but he's caught in the act, and the crime is traced back to Nirmali, and the film ends with both of them being arrested. Bones? Sorry. Bones and All follows the story of two young cannibal lovers, Marin and Lee. Marin's mother was also a cannibal, but she left her family from a very young age because she had very strong desires to eat her own child, so she left. And so Marin grew up with her father. However, eventually, when Marin was old enough, her father decided to leave because he no longer wanted to deal with her cannibalistic tendencies. And so this led Marin to taking to the streets, where she meets Sully, who was an older cannibal, who essentially becomes kind of a mentor for her. However, very soon after, he starts developing a very weird obsession with Marin, despite him being so much older and just knowing her for like 4 hours. So Marin decides to leave, which is when she meets Lee. The two of them fall in love and basically eat people together. But one day, they accidentally kill a man who has a wife, he has children, he has a life, and they typically don't kill people like that. So in order to avoid any confrontation with the police, they decide to leave their cannibalistic life behind. Unfortunately, Sully had, with his obsession, he had been following them the entire time, and he eventually breaks into their home, attacks Marin, and a physical fight breaks out where Lee is fatally stabbed, but in the end, Sully dies. However, Lee's wound was fatal, and they can't call the police. Obviously, they just killed a man. So in order to try to show Marin his love for her, he asks Marin to eat her so that their love can transcend his death. So moving on from those. Scholars note the importance of differentiating between a self and an other in order to understand the act of cannibalism and the films and the motif as less of a punishment and more of a unification. And so in classical mythology, Thyestes and Tereus both commit crimes of adultery and are punished by having their own children fed to them. By eating their children, since they would be the ones who essentially continue their bloodline, continue their legacy, by eating their children, they are essentially ending their own self. This is separate from what is shown in the films and in the motif, where the women are eating something other than themselves, and they are eating something that they want closer, but they cannot have for certain reasons. Scholars also note the importance of the patriarchy in women repressing their sexual desires. So they introduce the concept of a phallocentric society, where essentially women's needs and wants, especially their sexual desires, are not important at all because those are privileges that are reserved only for men. And so this translates to women having to repress their own desires in order to conform to certain standards. So in the motif, there's the theme of a repression and forbidden desires, but a lack of it. The women, instead of repressing their sexual desires to conform to the standards, they decide to cheat on their husbands, they decide to give in to their desires, which eventually leads to their downfall of having their lover fed to them and having to die in the end. This is shown in the films in a different way. In the film Amis, rather than giving into her desires, Nirmali refrains from having any sexual intercourse, any physical contact throughout the film. What makes Suma develop such an obsession with her is the fact that he cannot even touch her hand. They don't ever have any sort of physical touch. And so Nirmali knows that she's married, so she represses these desires, which is very similar to Bones and All, where they are never shown being intimate, having sexual intercourse, because in the movie, these cannibals have a very strong sense of smell. They can smell other cannibals, they can smell other people from miles away. So being that close to each other would essentially lead them to not be able to suppress these desires, so they would practically have to eat each other. And so they refrain from doing it whatsoever. There's also strong themes of jealousy and obsession in both the motif and the films. In the motif of the Eden Heart, the husbands are so obsessed with the idea of their wives belonging only to them. They are their property. They, especially Rasalu, who essentially raises his wife, and he never lets another man or anybody see her overall. So they are basically giving into this patriarchal idea that the women are supposed to be reduced only to their role of their wife. This is shown in Ames, in how Suma develops a very strong obsession with the idea of Nirmali because he can't have her. So this also translates to a strong jealousy for Nirmali's husband, who he can be with her. He can touch Nirmali, he can sleep with Nirmali, and Suma develops a strong resentment towards him, which is also reflected in Bones and All, where it is portrayed through the character of Sully, who Sully, after 4 short hours of knowing Marin, develops a very strong obsession with her. He wants to stay with her forever, and after Marin leaves and she finds Lee, he develops a very strong jealousy towards him, which eventually, as you see in all of these cases, eventually this obsession and jealousy leads to the downfall of the lovers. It leads to the downfall specifically of the woman. So I do not condone cannibalism. This is not what I'm saying. Don't eat each other. But in the motif and in media, this cannibalism is symbolizing a unification of love. So in the motif of the Eden heart, the women are eating their lover, and essentially through eating their lover, they are unifying their love forever. Their husbands were trying to punish the wives, but instead allowed them to be together forever, especially since the wives commit suicide at the end, they can be together even after death, which is very similar to both of the films, where Suman, essentially, he cannot enter Nirmali sexually, so he decides to enter her literally through his flesh, symbolizing their unification of their love. As well as Marin, in the end, they finally decide to consummate their love through Marin eating Lee, so that their love can transcend his death. So it is depicted very differently in modern media, but this motif of the Eden heart with the themes of repression of sexuality, obsession and jealousy, as well as the symbolizing of cannibalism, has been able to transcend time. Like I said, this is medieval literature, so this is from long ago, and we can still see it today. However, like I said, scholars still don't know the origins, so it would be interesting for future research to study the cultural context of the motif of the Eden heart to find its origins, and translate that to the films and see how the cannibalism is depicted similarly or differently in these films.